Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion on learner-centered assessments today. I wanted to ground to make sure, as folks know, an individual learner experiences a range of assessments over a course of a year. There are assessments for learning, assessments that are close to instruction, like an exit ticket or a weekly quiz to see how students are doing. And there are also assessments of learning, which are standardized and generally high stakes. These are often given at the end of the year, like the SBAC in California. Today, our panel of experts will discuss how learner-centered assessments of all types can be leveraged to create a better system of assessments. I'm Edward Hugh, Senior Program Officer at the Walton Family Foundation, and just to give you a sense of who's on the panel today, we have Akimi Gibson, VP and Educational Publisher at the Sesame Workshop, Steve Ritter, Founder and Chief Scientist at Carnegie Learning, Michelle, I just asked you, Michelle, Odemwingie, CEO at Achievement Network, and Lillian Pace, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at KnowledgeWorks. Lillian, how about you kick us off? Given your vantage point working with states and on policy, how are learner assessments already being used and used?
Yeah, well, first I want to say that I can't tell you how many times I tell people that I work on assessment policy and they immediately turn around and say, that has to be brutal right now. It can feel discouraging often to work on assessment policy right now. And I think part of that is this narrative that's played out where either we fiercely defend the status quo or we do away with it altogether. And the really encouraging new path forward that's emerging is around this learner-centered assessment innovation. So we know assessments are critically important tools to support learning, to help us make decisions about resource allocation, but we know we need to improve them. And the exciting thing is that that conversation is spreading like wildfire all over the nation. We're seeing a tremendous amount of interest in sort of across the board designing richer, more authentic performance tasks. We are seeing a lot of interest around, instead of kind of waiting until the end of the year to assess students, how do we get more frequent data points that can really drive and improve instructional practice? So those things are happening writ large. Those conversations are really, as I said, spreading around the country. There's really two themes I wanted to highlight for the bright spots, though, because I think they're really encouraging. The first is there's a lot of appetite now around thinking about systems of assessments. So how do we make sure that our summative assessments, which we administer, typically right now at the end of the year to tell us how students are doing overall, and our formative assessments that should be embedded in learning and rich, how do we get those to talk together? And Massachusetts is doing an incredible job as they are trying to reimagine how to assess science in their state. So they have created, and they're in the process of building this out in partnership with federal government through a waiver process. They are trying to build these rich simulation type tasks that students can engage in their formative experience in the classroom, and then experience those same simulation type experiences on a summative assessment. And that gets students engaged in much richer ways and tells us more about what they know. The other area I wanted to flag is around culturally and linguistically responsive assessments. So we are seeing a number of states saying, we want assessments where students see themselves in it. We talk about student engagement. If they don't see themselves in the assessment items, they're not going to be ready to perform at their best. So states like Hawaii, New Mexico, Louisiana, they're really trying to design these assessment tasks that represent the cultures and languages of the students that they serve.
Awesome. Michelle, Steve, Akimi, as folks who are working in assessments every day, tell me, why are learner-centered assessments important to you and your organization? We'll start with you, Michelle.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to apologize. A Wednesday panel means you get my Wednesday voice, which may not be a voice, but shout out to everybody who enjoyed all of ASU+GSV yesterday. I think it's important for us to just stay grounded that the purpose of assessments was and has always been about students. It's actually us, the adults, no shade, the policy people who got in the way. But assessments were always about understanding, what do students know and what do they need, and are we serving them in the right way? And so when we think about learner-student assessments and why that's important to ANET, that's the point. That's the whole purpose, is about understanding have we served our students well? And if not, how do we serve them better the next time? And so as we have been thinking about that, we have been asking ourselves, well, what is getting in the way of that primary premise being reality for every educator, right? Like if that's why we're all doing this, is serving students and each individual student in the classroom, what is happening in the design, in the behaviors that is actually making that harder? And oftentimes that means we have to unlearn the adult issues we've put around assessments. Not that the assessments are totally the problem. Sometimes it's us and how we weaponize the data against students and communities and families that has to change. And if we're not willing to unlearn and reimagine that, there's no redesign on the assessments that's going to change reality and outcomes, particularly for the kids that we care about most.
Thank you, Steve.
I wish I could disagree with Lillian and Shelta to add a little excitement and controversy, but I totally agree with what you just said. So, but I will give a different perspective. So my background's in cognitive psychology, understanding how people think and learn, and that's really the basis of what we do with Carnegie Learning. And for me, when we think about learner-centered assessments, what learner-centered means is we understand that knowledge builds on prior knowledge, and every student has different backgrounds, different interests, different experiences that they bring to the task. And so and fundamentally that means what assessment needs to be about is understanding the student's knowledge and ability on their own terms based on what they bring to the task. And the challenge is doing that in a way that is fair to every student and representative across the whole population. And that's the way we think about like how we can assess students as they learn.
Awesome, thank you. And Akimi, how about you at Sesame?
So I'll do a cheat and do a yes and to everything that was said here. So at Sesame Workshop, we envision a world where we can celebrate and document how children learn best, which is through play. So when we think about learner-centered assessments, we think about play-based assessments, and we think about the increasing the child's agency to actually lead the way through that discussion. And then we are the response mechanism for that. So if assessment is a play-based experience in itself, then it is the learning journey. It is the thing that gives me the feedback, that lets me go where I want to go. And we hope that the more knowledgeable others, the adults, the educators, the parents, that whole ecological model is a participant in that for the child.
Awesome, thank you all. When I think about something that's more learner-centered, I think it then necessarily needs to be more customized, more varied based on the students. Michelle, how does ANET maintain a high bar given that customization when designing test items or tests that are more customized and also reflective of the whole child? How do you balance that tension?
Well, I think I'll name some truths and some tensions and then how we think about it. So if you're unfamiliar, ANET, one of the primary things we provide school districts across the country are interim assessments, right? There are these 3 or 4 times a year progress monitoring tools anchored in high quality materials that give school leaders or district leaders visibility to what's going on across the board. And I think one truth we all have to just first start and sit with is that the research data is pretty clear. Most formative, interims, and summative assessments in our country are not working. We are assessing children at a high volume, and we are not changing the outcomes for them. And as we've increased testing, learning is decreasing. You have to start with this truth and not shy away from it, be honest about it, and stare it in the eye. And then you have to acknowledge the tensions, right? Like the tension you named, Edward. There are a lot of things that are fixed in the American school system. Grades, right? Like you're in 3rd grade because you're this age. Standards, the materials, and even materials that adapt. They're still like the materials that come from some degree of a set. But we serve a highly variable audience, students, learners, their backgrounds, their abilities, their learning and thinking differences, how they play. And so if assessments are doing what they're supposed to do, not what they're currently doing, what they're supposed to do, they help bridge that tension. How do I get an insight about the individual child that helps me go back into the fixed thing and use it better, right? How do I get an insight about what a student learns so I go back to my materials, to the right section of the materials? And the reason that assessments aren't working is because that how piece of like, how do I get an insight and go do something different doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Teachers are getting a lot of data about kids and not taking any different action. Saying it slower and louder does not reteach a child. And I'm partially saying that to myself as a former teacher who was like, let me explain it again, because I know my lesson was bomb and summarizing, y'all didn't get it. So I'm gonna redo the dance I did. Like, no, it didn't work, right? And you have to do something different. So what we have been focusing on historically at ANET is saying, okay, how do you give a student level insight to a teacher that will help them go back and do something different? So we obsessed on sharing what we call distractor rationale. We don't just tell you red, yellow, get green, who's who got it right, here's who got it wrong. We say, here is why little Billy didn't understand this problem. And by the way, it's him and these other 4 kids had this type of misunderstanding, and this group of students had a different type of misunderstanding. So you should not be sorting them or putting them in the exact same intervention because the breakdown in their learning is different. You need to do a targeted, different approach. And partners who were doing that were getting results. But here was the caveat of where we failed as an organization. We used to give guidance that said, to do that analysis well, we recommended you held 3 hours to analyze the data. A 3-hour data meeting was a previous requirement. I see you shaking your head. You're like, girl, who got 3 hours? Nobody. I do not have 3 hours, right? And so that was the previous guidance for ANET. And our data was clear. Schools who found the 3 hours were getting 6 months more learning. But who had 3 hours? So now the question we're asking ourselves is, how do we, as the technologist, as the designers, get you that insight faster so you can get that, you can understand what action to take in 3 minutes, 3 seconds, not 3 hours of analysis. And so I think that's one way we're saying we have to honor that there are some parts of most school systems, not all, most school systems have curriculum, have grades, and that's not radically changing at the rate we want it to. So how do we give them better insights about the student and the learner so they can go back into that high quality material, go back into that classroom, sharper and wiser and more responsive to the student?
Thank you for that. Steve, how about Carnegie Learning? Anything about your product or your approach that you would add on to Michelle's or something different?
Sure. Our primary approach to assessment is to embed it fundamentally in the instructional process. So we use AI software called Mathia, and the principle behind it is not to give students an instruction phase and an assessment phase. The instruction and assessment are fundamentally integrated. So what we do is give students complex multi-step problems to solve, and the AI software watches students as they solve those problems to get insights into how students are doing, how they perform step by step as they kind of show their work as they're solving these problems. And we use these insights to provide guidance to teachers in real time about what students are struggling with, what they're succeeding with, and the ways that they think about problem solving, which is the essence of formative assessment. And we think by embedding it in the instructional process itself, we're getting continual feedback about exactly what students need and what supports that they need from the teachers and other resources. Then we're also able to take those student actions within the software and correlate it with these end-of-year standardized tests in a way that, again, like we're able to value and understand the student's way of thinking and talk about how that relates to anticipated performance on their end-of-year test. With the goal of the dream is, if we can predict, because we've seen you in class every day solving problems just like a teacher would, if we can predict how well you're going to do on that end-of-year standardized test, you don't need to take that test. You've already taken it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Akimi, can you speak to your vantage point in the early childhood space? So we know that it's critical to track progress for little ones towards really critical developmental milestones. What are the risks or opportunities for a more customized approach in the early childhood space? Is this actually more important in the early childhood space, or actually more important to have a more standardized set of metrics?
Okay, I don't know if I'm going to get to opportunity because I'm in the zone of, right? So let me see what I can do here. So I'm going to start with a misquote, so forgive me on this, but we hold dear this basic notion that there's no such thing as a third grade shoe. Like, you can't just think about having these standards and having these benchmarks and expect children to get there. Learning is a nonlinear process. Right? And what we're trying to understand when we help children learn how to learn is the messy stuff. It's not the right answer. It is absolutely in the failure that we find the genius. So all the mistakes and reattempts and figuring it out, the problem solving that is more dynamic and doing it one-on-one, one-on-three, and bringing in a buddy to help you figure out, that's not being measured. And if development and learning is nonlinear, then curriculum needs to be nonlinear as well. So this is why I love the policies going last, Lillian, because how do you do that? How does it all happen if we want to meet the needs in that moment that you're talking about, Michelle, when none of it is linear? It's a fallacy in that sense. So we think about who needs to be at the table imagining this world that in some ways needs to go beyond the 3 hours, because 3 hours is a starting point, from the leaders who have to support in a nonlinear manner, right, to the educators who have to know curriculum inside, outside, and upside down, and has to listen for those misconceptions when a little one says a phoneme that's not necessarily mapped to whatever. And I'm not quite sure what that has to do with anything, but we understand it's there for us to look at. And we have to also imagine that those early years are when we identify what is necessary for this child to fully self-actualize and optimally become themselves, from the neurodivergent to the child who just got here. This is the beautiful system of our public schools. Anybody, anytime can walk in. And at that moment, we are faced with these challenges. So that's what we think about, is that we have to preserve that the developmental trajectory is specific to the child, and we have to be responsive. But how do you do that with an underpaid educator who went to school 20 years ago and was given a curriculum published 10 years ago and said, be at this chapter at this moment? How does that possibly happen? I know we're going to get to optimism, but I have to just put out that kind of inquiry.
Well, that is my next question, is how do you do this? You've all laid out a beautiful vision, truly, of student-centered instruction and assessment, but I can just imagine just like the reams of data to keep track of, the reams of differentiated lessons. How do we actually ensure that this doesn't create additional demands on teachers who were in some cases trained 20 years ago initially, or are taxed increasingly having to support students' learning loss and huge demands based off of the mental health needs that come out of the pandemic? How do we all start to do this? Like, part of the value of a standardized approach is that it's simpler for the educator. We'll start with you, Michelle.
What a question.
Well, I started with you.
Yeah, I was like, we made eye contact, and I was like, oh man, I know he's gonna call me.
Yeah.
I think that's the tension, because I think we all know that learning isn't linear, but the American school system is designed fixed. That is the tension. And for me, I'm a brutal realist, emphasis on brutal. And the reality is, you have to have, we have an educator workforce that is still trying to master the content themselves, because their learning wasn't linear, right? There are moments when I was teaching 7th grade math where I was like, well, dag nabbit, that's how that worked? The other day I was driving, and I'm being so serious, I called a team member. The other day I was driving, and I go, oh my gosh, I know how to explain system of equations in a real world situation now. And kids ask me that for years, and I never had one.
Can you teach us after this?
Yeah, I will talk about it, right? Okay, I will. I really felt like, I could have given my kids that problem instead of the basketball ones that were in the freaking, okay, I want to talk about the publishers. But our learning is continual, but that's not how the reality of where the majority of the students in American schools, that's not how they're experiencing learning right now. And I think the question you're asking, I view that as our responsibility as the designers. We have to make the role of educators easier, and not easier in terms of do the work for them, but to automate the parts of it that can be automated, or to like make the elements of their work. So for example, there is a lot that we can tell you right now about student writing samples. We see in our data that 92% of teachers don't open the open response questions and grade them. 92%. That's where the richest insights about a student live. They're not opening it because they don't have time. Okay, so then the question for us is like, how do we make that easier for them? Can we get them further on that? And that's what my team is asking. If 92% of them are not finding time for this, how do we figure out what we can do to make it easier? And I think that's our job. Like, we have to view ourselves to be the people who can like provide lift and wings to our educators so they can do the art of teaching. We should handle some of the science of it to make their jobs easier. I don't have the answers all the time, but we have to have the obsession of answering that question.
Steve, weigh in here. You shared a little bit about how your technology does some of the operational lift that Michelle spoke to about, if the students are mastering this on the interim assessment, don't deliver the summative. Like, that'll actually save everyone some time. Any other ways that you think about that tech can help solve this problem?
I mean, maybe people have heard about new large language models and ChatGPT at this conference, or
maybe just a little bit.
Maybe a couple of times. I'm actually pretty optimistic about those kinds of technology, but in a different way than people are often thinking about it. Those technologies they embed a lot of expertise. One part of expertise that they don't embed is pedagogical expertise, right? There's a difference between being an expert and taking the student's perspective and understanding what it's like to learn. But I think those models can be trained to understand the elements that students need to learn in order to become experts, right? And when I think about the future of assessment and like these open-ended items, right, I wouldn't think that those models inherently like just take their feedback on the open-ended item. That's not the right way to do it. But if you understand kind of the rubrics and the objectives, what we call knowledge components that we want students to learn as they're going through some bit of content, I think we can train AI models to look at what students are doing and understand how what they're doing relates to the course objectives and the things that we're trying to understand whether students know.
Awesome. Akimi, returning to you, are you in an optimistic place yet? How do you imagine pulling this all together?
All right, here I go. Optimism. So one optimistic point, we have to accept, especially little ones, before we re-engineer their dispositions towards learning, which is happening around 3rd grade, when they're opting out. For the really little ones, they are constantly showing us everything that they know. They don't withhold anything. If you want to know what a 4-year-old knows, just ask them. A 4-year-old will just tell you everything about that, and it's contextual. And so talk about near transfer and far and alike. There's nothing more magical than that. And so I'm really optimistic about thinking about not making pre-K more like 12th grade, but making 12th grade more like pre-K. And how can we do that? Right? And how can we help educators understand the developing child and be more playful with that child? There isn't an educator who is dedicated to this field who hasn't met a child and said, I know what you need. I just can't prove it. And in order for me to get you that service or something else, we have to go through these proof cases. So how can we increase the agency of the family? The other thing I'm optimistic about is give the knowledge to the family. Make it a digital portfolio from the time they are here through it's their knowledge. This is a highly transitory environment. Where children start out in school is not going to be where they end up in school. And you shouldn't be zip code related, right? You shouldn't get a better education in Montclair, New Jersey than in Newark. So we have to think about making the parent understand the same way we do in the medical field. And all of that medical information needs to be a part of the system so that that child we know that it's not about eyesight, we know it's not about hearing, we know something else. And so I just say, I know it's simple to say, make it about play and think about how schools can get ready for children as opposed to children getting ready for schools. I'm optimistic about that because I think teachers, I overheard one of the last sessions about these are the pandemic-born kids. They're in our system now. We don't know what they think. We just don't know. And so everything we thought we knew before, we don't know. And we graduated educators during the pandemic. We don't know that either, right? And we have a high incidence of stress. So how do we keep that compassionate classroom? How do we eliminate this notion of threat and safety? Because we can't learn if we think that some kind of violence is going to happen to me. So I'm optimistic that the education field is rising up and saying enough is enough. It's about the children, and how do we do this not in spite of them, right? How do we do this because of them? So I hold optimism in the people, quite frankly, Edward. And I adore technology, Sesame, 1969, we did it. And so I adore technology, but it's a relationship business, and I want the technology to be a tool to those relationships.
All right, Lillian, I'm going to yes, go for it.
I wanted to jump in here because I love all of this, and I think it's reminding me of so many conversations I've had in the summative space, with federal leaders. And, you want to talk about the worst offender of standardization, right? It's the policy framework, quite frankly, that our federal leaders have really put in place. And this was reminding me about a time when I worked on Capitol Hill. I guess it would probably been 2006, 2007. We were working on reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind Act, and we were starting to talk about innovative assessments. And in particular, we wanted to see rich performance assessments, replacing these, multiple choice tests that, every kid takes the exact same item. You can feed the answers through a Scantron. It's the best way to compare apples to apples. And the conversation died so quickly because you want to scare a policymaker, you have those policymakers thinking about a teacher in one classroom versus a teacher in another, hand grading, all of those assessment tasks. And that's a terrifying thought to think, well, how can we trust that data? How can we ensure that, one teacher is assessing the same way, or evaluating the same way as another teacher? And I reflect on that all the time, and I think about this promise of technology, right? And how different the conversation is today, right? We can absolutely do this differently. We don't have to have performance tasks the future of them standing alone on whether a teacher can grade it or not. Let me tell you, it's the best professional development a teacher will ever get, and I will stand by that through and through. But when it comes to policymakers, technology can really go a long way to easing their concerns about the reliability and validity of that data across schools, across districts, and across states.
So are you seeing some policy being implemented or adopted that allows for technology to provide for some more differentiation here?
Yeah. Ooh. So this is where maybe the optimism goes down a little.
We're riding the wave, folks. A little optimism, a little pessimism.
Yeah. So the last time we reauthorized the nation's K-12 education law, there was, again, a conversation around innovative assessments, and this idea emerged of, well, let's create this pilot program, like this space where any state that wants to think differently, whether it be embracing new kinds of technology and bring that in, that's the space where we're going to have them go and innovate. They just got to seek permissions from the federal government to do so, and they can move forward. Well, like in any kind of policymaking, that got negotiated down until it was covered in every guardrail you can imagine. And guess what? States don't want to deal with that. They don't and can't in many ways, right? I mean, there's not a lot of trust with the federal government right now. So if you're a state, it's come do this program, there's no money, whatever your idea is, good luck, build it all and then come to us and apply and we'll hopefully tell you yes. And then third, you gotta scale it in 5 years, and guess what? It has to be comparable to the old test. Well, that's a great standard for innovation. So why would a state want to do this, right? So what needs to happen, and here's maybe where I can bring some optimism back into the conversation. is we have to have a rich conversation at the federal level about what kinds of assessments are really going to support the personalization that we need in our learning environments moving forward. Policymakers are asking these questions. There's a request for information that the U.S. Department of Education just put out saying, we know we got to fix that program. How do we do it, right? So the conversations are starting in rich ways. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's so many great examples emerging across the country of states that are trying to do this work. So I'm pretty optimistic. So the first thing is we've got to fix the pathway to innovation. We have to give states a real pathway. Secondly, we got to fund it. You can't build a new assessment system while administering your old system. It takes money, right? So we have to be serious about how we're setting our state leaders up for success in that area. And then third, like we have to really start to think about the system of assessments. I think personally, we have had way too heavy a footprint of a summative assessment framework in this country. I want to talk about how we've used that to then go weaponize the data. I love that comment. I could have a whole nother panel with you on that one. We've got to get serious about what the right size of the footprint is for the summative, how we bring in all of these rich, formative and interim assessments and align those so they're talking to each other. And so a student is experiencing an aligned assessment framework as they're moving throughout their K-12 journey.
So I'm just thinking back to my novice teacher days 20-some odd years ago when I was a struggling first-year teacher. And even in a world where we imagine a smaller summative and we talk about kind of rich formative assessments that we want teachers to administer, I so often find teachers at a loss about how this all nests together, and then they may misuse things like, oh, my summit is going to tell me how to inform my instruction the next day, which isn't what it was designed to do. You all who are on the ground designing these systems, how do we actually prevent then the assessment system that Lillian speaks towards building from being misused, right? Because we'll have to have a network and landscape of assessments that do different things. Again, that's a very technically sophisticated set of things for a 21-year-old Edward to have to understand how to utilize well and where he should be getting what information from. How do you imagine setting up guardrails, what systems should be developed to ensure that assessments are used for the right purposes at the right time? Michelle, that's the hard one, so I'm going to go to you again first.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. So, I'm sorry, I don't mean to deep sigh after you every time, Edward, so I don't take it personal. I think, one, I want to say something that's controversial, but it's important to ground ourselves in. Accountability is not a bad thing. If we view ourselves accountable to young people. And the reason accountability started out in education is because of the vast injustice rooted in race and socioeconomics in this country, because separate was never equal, and we needed to prove that you were doing separate and not equal. That's when we started talking about, like, let's look at the testing. Let's look at the data. A nation was at risk, and it's just more at risk. And I think we sometimes forget that assessments came in at a time to address an injustice that was pervasive. And Ibram Kendi, who writes about anti-racism, talks about if you don't measure it, then people don't believe it. And so we needed to measure and put the truth on the table. And so sometimes I think we get, oh no, accountability is a bad thing, but I do want you to be accountable to kids and communities that are like the one I grew up in, where justice wasn't happening. I wanted my teachers to be accountable for failing me. I didn't fail no classes, but like failing me in terms of instruction and learning. I wanted them to be held accountable to that. But right now, we're putting the accountability in the wrong energy. We're using it to weaponize against communities instead of to serve them better. And I think on your Pathways to Innovation comment, Lillian, it was so fascinating because you're having that conversation at the federal level, and I've been having it with district leaders, and they are scared to innovate. Teachers are scared to innovate. Wait, how's this gonna work? I never learned like that. I've never experienced that. You want me to design a who and a what, and you're telling me that if my scores don't go up next year, you're not going to close my building? Right. Because it takes time to adapt that. So I do think we have to figure out innovation and learning and assessment literacy pathways for every level of educator in the system, whether that is the CAO and superintendent, the school leader, or the teacher, to better understand how doing something different can be still safe and helpful, and the truth that I started with, that what you're doing right now ain't working. Because sometimes they forget that detail. They're like, I can't do something new. I'm like, you know your kids are failing now, right? Like what we're doing now doesn't work, so we should feel urgency to change. And I think one way in which we can all do better is we have been talking about, one of the policies Lillian has been referencing is this work that's designed to take what we call through-year assessments, where you're taking those assessments at the end of the year to get rid of the summative. And what I found, I will never forget talking to a district leader I spoke to about this, and what my takeaway from it was, we are changing the wrong part. We were changing the end-of-year component when he was stressed about the high-stakes component. And he's like, so you're just gonna take the high stakes and split it up over the year so I'm stressed 4 times a year? And I was like, well, hot diggity dog, no. Well, like, I was like, good point, talk to you later, we're gonna keep innovating. But like, we're not getting at the core of their problem. And so I think that's one of the areas we have to do to ensure that they use the data right. We have to listen to their reality more to understand the real pain point. I think we're solving a policy pain point. Last thing, I've taken up too much time. We also did an assessment across all of Louisiana. We did almost every parish and every district. The number one things that students were being over-tested on were not summatives. They weren't even the diagnostic or the interim. It was that teachers didn't trust any of those other data, so they added more unit tests and end-of-year tests and quizzes. So teachers were the number one culprit because they were like, well, the data y'all are giving me, I don't trust. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, we don't listen enough to what's the real problem, so then we innovate around things that ain't their issue.
On top of. Akimi, any lessons to be learned from the early childhood space where there's less of an accountability pressure?
Yeah, it's hard for me not to want to. Is that okay? Can I? Okay. So because I want to add to that, because the other thing here to bring to mind is that we have to hold our high schools and colleges and university accountable as well. And we have to, teachers are researchers, and they have to enter into the field just as curious as their children and students, wanting to know, how can I get to know you better and what you know? Like, we have to almost reimagine what the ed schools are doing to prepare teachers for this environment. What is the apprenticeship model? How can we engage? Why aren't high schoolers teaching kindergartners? Why can't we just reimagine the system and elevate the human capital a little bit more? So it's just and I'm struck by this notion of bias within the assessment when bias is in the teaching system itself. Like, and so how can we comfortably separate out that if we do that, then that may be biased, right? The teaching itself can be biased. And so if we're gonna treat bias at the core, and then it filters all the way through. That was not at all what Edward wanted me to answer, but I had to kind of give a little bit of
it
something
was better,
over here.
Akimi,
Okay, thank you.
I see the clock ticking rapidly, so I just want to start to bring us to a close. Thank you all. So in closing, I just want to bring us back to the theme of this year's ASU+GSV, which is Brave New World, and want us to consider, as I think our panelists have, to reflect on the paradigms around assessments that might really limit our abilities to explore a brave new world of more student-centered instruction and assessment. And want to invite folks, very briefly, because we've got 2 minutes, 30 seconds, what is one short closing or reflection that you want to kind of speak into existence for this audience? And I'll start with Steve.
Great. I love this conversation about trust and risk, which is really, like, in talking about play at the higher levels, what it really is about letting students and letting teachers take risks and do things in their own way. And I think the way I would frame it is, we need to have a discussion about what assessment really is. People often confuse assessment with testing, where assessment is really about, like, understanding the student. And that doesn't have to happen through a test. And that's kind of what I'm optimistic about, is we're moving towards an environment where we'll be able to understand students without necessarily doing these formal tests that are designed to really narrow the student's experience in order to kind of standardize and statistically, equate students.
Michelle, what are you leaving us with?
Yeah, similarly, I'm thinking a lot about, I'm optimistic that as we continue to think about assessments and understanding the child wholly, we'll stop having that conversation about, did they master fractions, but do they believe themselves to be a reader and a mathematician? Because the data is clear that those data points matter just as much as the academic ones, and that will give more holistic data points and insights about students than just ones about academic content.
Lillian?
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on how hard innovation is in the education space. Let's not forget. Assessments are the gatekeepers to opportunity for so many children in our system. They are how we decide whether students can graduate in many states. They're how we decide which students get into these talented and gifted programs. They're how we decide whether a student's good enough to get admitted into a college, right? I mean, we use these as gatekeepers of opportunity, yet so many of our kids don't see themselves in that assessment, right? They don't feel engaged or excited, and so that means they're not showing what they know and can do. We have got to figure out how to innovate in this space, and we've got to build the trust to do that in education. And I know there is a fear to try brave and bold new things in education because we don't want to experiment on kids, and I get that. But imagine if we told, Henry Ford, we want you to build a faster and safer and maybe rainproof way, right, to get from one community to another, but we want it to be comparable to the horse and buggy. Go. Right? That's not the conditions for innovation, and we have to have a serious conversation in this country about how to set our innovators up for success.
Akimi, take us home.
All right, I will say that kids are about to call BS on us, and because we are not answering their big questions, they understand that the water is filthy. They get that the air we can't breathe. There's more wildfires in places there shouldn't be. There are climate migrants all over the place, and they know that we're not asking the right levels of questions. So I'm optimistic because the kids are engaged, and so before they call BS on us, I take us up on the challenge to say, let's call BS on the system. Let's reimagine it. And to your point, it is broken. It's already broken, people. So we can glue it back together and break it again, but that doesn't seem like a good use of our time. It is broken, it isn't working, and so what do we really have to lose by doing something else and better that we can't even imagine today?
Awesome, thank you, Akimi. I'm so excited by all of the world. We entered this conversation as assessment on learners, this conversation around learner-centered assessments, and really have broadened it as a focal point and opportunity to change the system as we know it. So thank you all for engaging us in the conversation, and thank you all.